The challenge for me today is to bring reference to this green tie that I'm wearing into the introduction of our scheduled topic, Homelessness, the State of Portland's Very Poor. A connection is not that difficult to make. Many of the Irish immigrants to America, my great-grandfather included, were among the poor of the last century. Often the newcomers to America who remained in the big cities were crammed into small rooms in dingy tenement housing if they were fortunate to have a designated roof over their heads. But times have changed in this prosperous land of government assistance and big city social service programs, right? Not really. As winter ends, the tens of thousands of very poor homeless people across the country who have survived the worst of the elements in doorways or cardboard boxes can look forward really only to an improvement in the weather. Portland is no exception. Here are a few statistics to depict the scope of the local problem. While the population of the county grew by 4% during the 1980s, the number of persons living at or below the federal poverty level increased by 20% to nearly 75,000 by 1990. It's estimated that over the course of a single year, 15,000 persons are homeless in Multnomah County. Affordable housing is hard to come by. For some 23,000 households seeking low-end housing units in 1993, only 12,000 units are available. The waiting list with the Housing Authority of Portland for Section 8 and public housing currently exceeds 10,000. What are we doing to come to terms with this chronic and dismaying condition in our community? Joining us for an in-depth look at the problem and with a challenge for a greater local effort to solve homelessness in our community are two leaders at the forefront of this effort, Portland City Commissioner Gretchen Kafoury and Jean DeMaster, longtime director of Portland's transition projects serving the homeless and low-income people of Portland. Gretchen Kafoury began her public career 2 decades ago as a grassroots activist and citizen lobbyist at the legislature, promoting, among other causes, legal services to the poor. During her 4 terms as a state representative, she chaired the Human Resources Committee and championed improvements in several social service areas, including better housing for low-income families. After 6 years on the Multnomah County Commission, she was elected to the Portland City Council in 1991. She's responsible for the team of city bureaus which weaves together the city's programs for affordable housing, community development, and help to the homeless. These include the Bureau of Buildings, Housing and Community Development, as well as the Portland Development Commission's housing program. Jean DeMaster was for 11 years this region's leading homeless advocate during her term as Director of Transition Projects. She stepped down from that post last year after quadrupling the agency's budget and expanding its programs to include alcohol and drug treatment, crisis intervention services, corrections counseling, and shelter care management. She is currently manager of Portland's Adult Care Home program. Jean began working in Portland in the early 1970s after receiving a master's degree in clinical psychology from the University of Minnesota. Before leading transition projects, she co-founded the Technical Assistance Program for Community Services in this region, reinforcing her strong emphasis on assisting providers of service and improving service delivery systems. Together, Commissioner Kafoury and Ms. DeMaster are 2 of the architects of the City of Portland and Multnomah County's new Shelter Reconfiguration Plan, a model program for the delivery of shelter to the downtown homeless, which we'll hear more about today. Please join me in welcoming our speakers to the Portland City Club. We'll begin with Jean DeMaster.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here at City Club today, but Gretchen advises me, I have to say, that I was not always a strong advocate for the Shelter Reconfiguration Plan and frequently was an adversary to the plan. So I have to set that record clear. Being in transition projects for 11 years, I literally saw tens of thousands of people pass through the shelter. Now, in the adult care program where I currently work, I am struck by the number of homeless people who disappeared from the shelter but have actually reappeared in adult foster homes. Let me start this speech by giving you an example. A woman who I knew well in the shelter, let me just call her Carol, never returned one night, and that wasn't uncommon because people didn't always return every night. When she didn't return after several nights, we tried to find her and couldn't find her. This woman had a mental handicap and could function only semi-independently. She was gone for the shelter. I didn't know what happened until I was touring an adult foster home, and I found that actually the Multnomah County Public Guardian had found her and had pulled her out of the situation that she was in. But by the time she was found, she had been severely abused by several months after being kidnapped by someone because she was living on the streets. For example, her weight had dropped from probably about 130 to 80 pounds as a result of the abuse. In the adult foster home where she was placed, she is safe and she's relatively happy. She will never recover from her mental disability, nor will she recover from the emotional scars of her being taken as a street person. But now she is safe. I think we have seen a growing number of buildings serving homeless women, particularly the Barbara Mayer building and other buildings named after homeless women who have died because they've been living on the streets. When homeless people, like this woman Carol, have lost everything, including their health, or have reached age 65, they finally can receive safe housing because there's a mechanism to pay for it. In her case, she got Medicaid. In other cases, it's Social Security. But the real issue here today, and always the issue for resolving homelessness, is not do we want to house the homeless, but how are we going to pay for it? Medicaid payments in adult foster homes begin at about $800 a month. The individual receives a safe place to stay, 3 meals a day, and care for their medical problems or other problems. Homes that have a Medicaid contract also have a visiting nurse seeing people, and oftentimes there's a case manager. In contrast, at transition projects, the shelters receive about $200 a month. For that, they can provide a night of shelter and perhaps 1 meal a day. People are on their own for the rest of the time. I think it's important as a society that we care for elderly people and people with disabilities. In Multnomah County, there are approximately 650 adult foster homes caring for about 2,000 people. Certainly, the adult foster care system is not a perfect system, and the recent media attention to the adult foster care system points that out. It's a system, though, that recognizes its deficiencies and is working hard to correct them. But for the homeless, the situation is very different because there's no mechanism to pay for the housing. There were certainly several times in my life when I could have ended up homeless if I hadn't gotten the right break or had taken one road as opposed to the other. Certainly, it's not entirely clear why some people fall victim to alcoholism or drug addiction or mental illness and others do not. Perhaps I worked at transition projects to avoid being homeless. Some would say now that I'm working for aging services to avoid growing old. I hope that that's true. But shelters for the homeless receive approximately $200 a month or less per person. Adult care homes, in contrast, get $800 a month. In contrast to that, nursing homes get $2,000 or $3,000 per person. We need to look at what is cost-effective for serving Portland's homeless. But to do that, I think we have to look at first why people are homeless. The Shelter Reconfiguration Plan is a great blueprint for providing assistance to adults, single adults without children who are homeless in our community. But I think we need that same kind of blueprint for homeless families, including women and children who are victims of domestic violence, as well as homeless youth. In developing these blueprints for our community, I think we have to say, as citizens of our community, that there should be an agreement that children in Portland should not be homeless. As we develop the next Shelter Reconfiguration Plan for families, including children, and for youth, we should just make an agreement that we want a system where children do not have to live in shelters or live in cars or live in abandoned buildings. It's our community, and we have some degree of say in what the priorities are for spending money, and I think that's one of them, that we will house homeless children. I think a second priority should be that as a community, we want to have enough affordable housing for all of the households in our community, for all income levels, not just for some, but for all. In that regard, I think that Multnomah County Chair Beverly Stein is right, and I'm not just saying that because she's my new boss. I really do think that she's right when she says that we have to attack problems like homelessness from their very foundation. We have to strengthen the family unit. We need to work to prevent homelessness, not just respond to homelessness once the homeless people are on our streets. We need to look at ways to keep families together and prevent people from being homeless. Certainly no one wants to be homeless. No one wants to see their young children be homeless and living in a car. But also no one wants to see their adult children be homeless either. Well, why are people homeless? The answer is simple. They don't have enough money to pay for the housing that's available to them. Sure, within the homeless population there are drifters, or the proverbial homeless, the hobos. Those are maybe 5% of the homeless population. But I think we have to recognize that the largest percent of people who are homeless today are women and women with children. Unable to pay for their own housing, women and children are forced into shelters, into abandoned buildings, into situations of domestic violence, and to living on the streets. The real question is, why don't they have the money to pay for their own housing? Certainly, there are a lot of jobs. You can open the Oregonian any day and find page after page of jobs. And there are a small proportion of homeless people that actually can look in the Oregonian and get a job. I would say again, from my experience at transition projects, maybe 5% of the homeless people could actually look in the Oregonian and find a job. People who can get jobs, get them, and avoid being homeless altogether. So if we look at the homeless population and eliminate the people that are drifters or hobos, and eliminate the people that can get jobs easily, who are we looking at? Who's left in Portland's homeless population? The people that are left are people that are affected by alcoholism and drug addiction. This clearly includes single men and women who are alcoholics and addicts, the ones that we traditionally think of as the homeless. But also, alcoholism and addiction affect a lot more people than just single men and women. Alcoholism and addiction affect single parents and their children, and two-parent families and their children, where the parents cannot work because of the alcoholism or the addiction. Very often, when we are examining the reasons why homeless parents can't work, the parents will say, "I'm homeless because I don't have a job," where the real answer translates to, "I can't keep a job because of my alcoholism or my addiction." This group of people who are affected by alcoholism addiction clearly involves homeless youth. Whether their chemical dependency started before they became homeless or whether they became chemically dependent while they were living on the streets, the fact is that the estimates are at least 70% of homeless youth have alcohol and drug abuse problems. Without intervention, these homeless youth will clearly just grow up to be homeless adults. Also in this group of people who are homeless because of alcoholism or addiction, we need to include mentally ill people, some of whom are also addicted to alcohol and drugs in addition to being mentally ill. Finally, in this group of homeless people who are homeless because of someone's alcoholism or addiction, I think we also need to include women and children who are victims of domestic violence. In the shelters for victims of domestic violence, when women tell their stories of why they were victims or how they came to be victims, the stories almost always start with, "He had been drinking for a long time when he started hitting me. He only hits me after he's been drinking. He was coming down from being on drugs." The stories start with the abuser having been using alcohol and drugs when the abuse started. Now, most of these women don't abuse alcohol and drugs, and certainly their very young children don't abuse alcohol and drugs, but the cause of the domestic violence and the way to resolve it involves overcoming alcoholism and drug addiction. I firmly believe that alcoholism and drug addiction are diseases, and that the cure is alcohol and drug treatment followed by abstinence. But I also believe that untreated alcoholism and addiction are the leading cause of homelessness for single men and women, as well as for many families, including parents and children. But to me, there is some good news here. And the good news is that alcoholism and addiction are diseases, and that we as a society know how to overcome alcoholism addiction. The answer is alcohol and drug treatment and alcohol and drug-free housing. Especially for homeless people, the answer lies in alcohol and drug-free housing. Alcohol and drug-free housing is safe, clean housing where the primary focus is on assisting the individual to overcome their addiction. It's not on having the person go back to work. It's not on having them look to get a job, because that would be short-sighted. The first order of business is for the individual to overcome their addiction. For families, I think this is especially important, as families need housing as parents complete alcohol and drug treatment. Children need to be able to go to school or to be in child care while their parents receive treatment. Many homeless parents can't go into treatment or won't go into treatment because of the risk that they will lose their children is too high. So instead, they don't go into treatment, they stay addicted, and their children suffer the consequences. There are many examples of successful programs with alcohol and drug-free housing. Transition Projects, Central City Concern, Ecumenical Ministries all offer successful programs. I think also when we look at homelessness, we have to acknowledge that there are a growing number of people who are homeless with a disability that I'm going to call lack of ability to make good decisions. You and I would say to ourselves, we'll never let ourselves be homeless. We'll never let our families or our children be homeless. Why did these people, these homeless people, allow themselves and their children to be homeless? And I think it is that a growing number of homeless people lack the set of skills that other non-homeless people like you and I have. And these skills include the ability to make decisions with long-term rather than short-term benefits, the ability to think ahead, the ability to make provision for the unforeseen, the ability to control your anger, the ability to be realistic about your living situation, and the ability to not think that the world owes you something. Oh, you can say, well, these are things that each of us has control over, but I would disagree in regard to homeless people. These are a set of mental skills which a substantial portion of the homeless population lack. Whether inherited or learned or not learned, there are many homeless adults that just don't have these skills. We can disagree whether or not they should or shouldn't feel that way, but they don't have this set of skills. And I'm mentioning this because I think it's important in resolving homelessness to acknowledge that homeless people are often operating from a different framework in interacting with the world than you and I would. You can predict how long someone is going to be homeless based on the lack of these skills. First of all, these skills, making good decisions, planning ahead, postponing gratification, are what results in higher paying jobs. People without these skills don't have good jobs, don't earn good incomes, and have little stability in their lives. We need to factor in this lack of decision making into our plan to resolve homelessness. Finally, I just want to say that in terms of people who are refusing to deal with their alcoholism or deal with their addiction, I think we need to, as a community, as our resolve as a community, ensure that they are not forced to live outside. In our agreements as a community, we should say every person in our community gets a place to live inside. It may be a large building with a cement floor and cement walls, but I think we should ensure as a community that everybody gets to live inside. In conclusion, I think that the key to resolving homelessness starts with housing, but housing alone is not enough. It's like having a car all by itself won't allow you to travel from here to there. You have to continually be able to pay for gasoline and hopefully occasionally be able to pay for car repairs. Otherwise, in this simple analogy, the car won't run. The same thing is true with overcoming homelessness. Without safe, affordable housing, we can't begin to address the problem. But the gasoline is also needed. Treatment for alcoholism, treatment for addiction, treatment for mental illness, job counseling, rehabilitation services, counseling for victims of domestic violence, and services for homeless youth. We need to come up with a plan of how to resolve homelessness and how to implement this plan. One of the people that has been most instrumental in developing these plans is, of course, Gretchen Kafoury. Gretchen is not alone as a politician or as a person in fighting homelessness, but she certainly is providing the leadership, the thoughtfulness, and the energy necessary to get a handle on this problem, which is life and death for many of Portland's citizens. Gretchen.
I should have got a booster chair.
You want to bring that?
No, it's all right. I don't know how to. Okay. Thank you, Jean. I'm delighted to be here today, and part of the delight for me is being able to thank Jean for her many years of hard work and leadership at transition projects. She, of anyone in this room, has made a major difference in the lives of thousands of Portland's very, very poor citizens, and we are all in her debt. Thank you. Our topic today is homelessness, and somewhat uncharacteristically, I have written this out. I want to expand the theme a bit of homelessness and talk with you about what's happening with housing prices in Portland, the effect these prices have on the working class, as well as the poor and the very poor. As we get further into the discussion, I think the effect of the housing market on homelessness will be obvious. People are homeless because they don't have a home. If we don't change the trends, however, in our housing prices, many more Portlanders are going to find housing out of their reach. Recapping some of Jean's main points, Portland does have a nationally recognized system for working with the homeless. Last week, when Tipper Gore was here, she visited some of our model programs. We get lots of credit nationally for the success of the work we have done here. At the same time, Volunteers of America were in City Hall and told me that they see 127 families every week that need shelter. Every week. That's just one of the many social service programs that work with Portland's families. As Jean mentioned, some of these people sleep in cars, others live with relatives, and unfortunately, a number of them are literally on the street. The fact remains that despite the visible homeless, the single adults that draw the most attention and bother businesses the most, the largest percentage of the homeless are families. When Recovery Inn closes in July, it will cause a crisis because these are visible homeless, and more will be milling on our streets. But an even larger cloud is gathering, and unless we're ready for it, all our efforts to provide basic, decent shelter for anyone will be eclipsed by many, many more needing housing services. I believe Portland is on the verge of an affordable housing crisis. This is new, very new for us. Historically in Portland, housing has always been affordable. It's one of the reasons people have moved here. Probably safe to say that most of us here in the audience have never had to worry about finding affordable housing in Portland. Like me, 10 or 20 or even 30 years ago, most of us settled into payments on large 3-bedroom homes at affordable prices. Just for a test, how many people in this room owned their first home by the time they were 30? How many of your kids, assuming they are in their 20s or 30s, can do this today? A lot fewer. So it isn't just something that impacts those people, it impacts all of us. Thanks to the easy investments that we made, we now have housing security and the peace of mind that comes with it. That peace of mind is no longer available to working people in this city. Not only does housing security and stability escape the poor, it is now out of the reach of much of the working class and unthinkable for many young. The average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Portland is $560 a month. The average wage for a single parent of $27,000 would allow them to just barely afford that apartment. The bulk of single parents earning that median income are now hard-pressed to rent the space and certainly could not afford to buy the median-priced home with a 20% down payment that would be required. They simply don't have that access to capital, and it shows the market is rising because barely a year ago they would have only needed 10% of the house payment for a down payment.
I haven't used this.
I don't care. Thanks. The reason Portland's on this verge of a serious affordable housing crisis stems from three converging factors, in my opinion. One is the loss of our local capacity to fund any local housing services. Tax increment was a very valuable tool that we used downtown. As a result of Measure 5, we no longer have that. Housing prices, as I mentioned, are rapidly rising in Portland. And remember that wages in this community have not kept pace with the rise in housing prices and rent costs. Finally, the new direction in Congress and the federal dollars for housing and urban development, I think we all agree, will continue to decline as they did during the 80s. So we have three things going on at once: no local source of revenue, housing market going crazy, and federal government continuing to withdraw. This, to me, is the background of this crisis. In Portland, we have had the luxury of being 20 years behind most national trends. As we saw other metropolitan areas choked by the horrors of smog and sprawl, we followed Governor McCall's advice and pioneered the urban growth boundary. As we saw once vibrant downtowns decay, we committed to Mayor Goldschmidt's call for a transit mall and a booming central core. Mayor Clark built on that work by investing in downtown and provided housing for all income levels, not just the middle class and upper class. These and many other public decisions were smart choices. Now, as others are moving here in record numbers drawn by the combination of our smart choices and their mistakes, land values have skyrocketed. This appreciation has been good for economic growth, but this growth, so good for business owners and especially good for owners of more than one property, is not good for the average worker or for the young family. And unless we act now, the complexion of this city could be changed forever. Unless we harness this growth and channel some of its economic benefit into homes for working people, the price of this decade may be the loss of our region's much vaunted livability. Portland would not be the first place this has happened. As a rule, the nation's urban areas have gone down one of two paths: inner city decay or gentrification. In Washington, D.C., they've given up on the urban core. In San Francisco, it's reserved primarily for higher paid professionals. I believe we can learn from these examples and design a better way. Portland must remain, we must remain a city where a working family can put down roots. Reasonable home prices allow families to stay put. Affordable housing gives kids rooms to play and the space to grow up healthy. Affordable and diverse housing keeps Portland as a city with the highest percentage of our children in public schools. It creates an inner city that is shared by the rich and the poor, and it is the foundation that allows citizens to build a city, a community around them. We know what will happen if we don't act now. Rising land values will concentrate poverty into smaller and smaller areas. As the gap grows, the rich will work harder and harder to isolate themselves from the poor. Gated communities on one end of town, dirty, overcrowded slums on the other. This is not just a description of the future. This is the most of the country and unfortunately the better part of the West Coast. So I promised Don Frisbee I wouldn't be all negative, so now what can we do? There are two ways to keep housing affordable in Portland. The first is to raise the average wage. I mentioned that the wages and the housing costs are very different these days. The first is to raise the wage of all Portlanders to substantially above the current median. I'd love to see this happen. I don't know any way to do it. In my 10 years in local government, I haven't been particularly impressed with the success of our economic development work. I just don't think local government is effective when it tries to create jobs in the private sector. Another way is to invest in affordable housing. In order to maintain the urban growth boundary, we have agreed as a community that Portland needs 50,000 new units of housing within the city limits. This fits with the Metro 2040 goals. It fits with Portland's future focus goals. It amounts to 2,500 units a year. Recently, in the low interest rate, high development activity years of 91 to 94, the city was averaging about 1,000 new housing units a year, market-driven, about 40% of what is needed. We need to increase production, therefore, by 1,500 units a year. Without worrying about affordability, 1,500 units a year is a very ambitious goal. And if we worry about affordability, we have even more of a challenge. But if we do it right, we can move Portland into continuing to be a national model for all kinds of things. Our challenge, therefore, is simple. Build 1,500 affordable housing units each year for the next 20 years. Sounds scary, doesn't it? But the good news is that as a result of lots of work in the last few years, our private developers and community development corporations have the ability to build this housing. They have been very, very busy and very productive in the last 4 or 5 years. What they need to get the job done to meet this additional 1,500 units of affordable housing is an investment of cash. So today, I'm asking for your help. In the same way that we made downtown redevelopment a priority, in the same way we've built light rail, a convention center, a rose garden, a zoo, a Pioneer Square, so many other pieces of Portland, now we must turn our attention to what we used to take for granted, decent and affordable housing for all Portlanders. Our starting goal should be $15 million a year in new resources. This amounts to an average investment of $10,000 per unit for each of these 1,500 units that the market is missing. It sounds big, but let me put it into perspective for you. The city has spent $20 million a year for each of the last 20 years in downtown. $20 million a year to rebuild and redevelop downtown, not all for housing, but in the urban renewal years. We have a history in Portland of paying for things we value. Our local share of the next light rail line is $450 million. We are currently working on plans to put $110 million in infrastructure into the River District. We put $40 million of infrastructure into the Blazer Arena. The combined sewer overflow program to protect the Columbia and Willamette rivers has a tab of $700 million. Voters recently supported Portland Parks, and hopefully in May will vote to fund region-wide open spaces. All of these things have cost money, and we have paid for them. We pay for things of value. More important than all the numbers, though, is a simple truth that a housing fund is a good investment. As we have proven downtown with the tax increment program, and we must now demonstrate it citywide, smart investment in housing pays for itself with increased tax value. Smart investment in housing pays for itself. A $10,000 investment, for example, in these 1,500 new units, if they're valued at an average of $100,000, will pay back the tax rolls in 6 years. Every unit of housing additionally creates jobs, builds new customers for neighborhood stores, and protects our environment by sustaining the urban growth boundary. By spending $150 million, a fraction of what some of these other major public works projects have cost, over the next 10 years, we will spur close to $1 billion of construction activity, which means more jobs and more additional economic spin-offs. An investment in affordable housing will allow all of the neighborhoods of this city to win. If we invest $15 million a year, we can finish the River District as a neighborhood for all income levels. If we invest $15 million, we can finish the shelter reconfiguration, and hopefully all homeless people can stay in a decent facility while they begin the work that Jean outlined toward permanent solutions for their lives. And if we invest $15 million, we can design tasteful, affordable, compatible units that will enhance our neighborhoods and preserve our families. In closing, I should leave you with several specifics of what you can do to help the homeless. I could ask you to write personal checks to the many social service agencies providing those services. The Transition Projects Board is here. I'm sure they'd love to take your money. The Salvation Army is here. The Burnside Advocates Group, BAG, is here. They would love to take your checks. They all operate on shoestrings and are desperate for cash and volunteers. I could also urge you to take your returnable cans and bottles. This is my favorite program. To Nature's, any nature store, to the Hollywood Fred Meyers, or starting next month to a Plaid Pantry. I just, as an aside, have to tell you that the kids at Alameda School raised $600 by returning their cans and bottles for 1 week. Their goal was $200, and in 1 week of doing that, they raised $600. This is a great program, and I do think it has the potential for getting Portlanders on board to help the homeless with your cans and bottles. But what I really need you to do is leave here today with the knowledge and understanding that Portland has a housing crisis. Our own Portland has a housing crisis. Talk to your friends, your co-workers. Help us devise a community strategy to reach this $15 million goal. Next week, I'm introducing a resolution to City Council to ask them to make finding the $15 million a year for affordable housing a top priority. It's at 10 a.m. on Wednesday, if anyone wants to come. I think this is the single greatest thing this city can do today to ensure its future. It's an achievable goal, and it's a bargain for Portland. For $15 million, we can house the homeless, build the River District, and invest in Portland's neighborhoods. I need you to join me in this cost-effective and affordable effort to keep Portland a very, very special place. Thank you.
Thank you both for the challenges you brought us today. Now it's time for questions from the City Club audience. Again, the microphone here is in the center of the room. Please give your name and identify yourself as a member of the club. We'll start with 2 prepared questions. The first is from Ann Jarvis of the board.
Thank you, Jean and Gretchen. On a national and perhaps state level, we seem to have embarked on a period in which many people believe that the ability of government to do much of anything well is extremely limited. How will this attitude affect local government efforts like the ones you have described to provide affordable housing, and what can or should we do to combat this attitude?
Well, I just refuse to accept that in Portland, Oregon, we believe that local government is ineffective or unable to do anything well. I think there is. I certainly don't think local government is exempt from the crisis of confidence, but I just refuse to believe that as a community, if we set this as a goal for ourselves, that it isn't something we can do. Any of the major activities, the convention center, the Blazer Arena that I mentioned, now the plans for the River District, these are largely private, not the convention center, but the Blazer Arena and the River District are private initiatives, and yet when something is going to work in Portland, people come to local government. So
I also think that in terms of making local government work, when we as citizens say to government, here's what our priorities are, and enforce them by who we elect in government, we can make a change. And I think we have done that with both the City Council and the County Commission, and we just need to continue to elect people that support the kind of values that we want.
Next question is from Buzz Marin.
Buzz Marin, City Club member. Could you comment on the progress that we've made in helping homeless youth?
I don't think that we've come near far enough in terms of helping homeless youth, and you need only drive near outside in or downtown to see homeless youth sleeping outside every night, to see homeless youth outside in the daytime without anything to do. We have a good start on resolving the problem, and we have a number of agencies that are trying desperately hard to resolve the problem, but without adequate funding, both for outreach to bring kids in and for transitional housing and programs for kids, we aren't going to get anywhere. And I think it's one of the things that, as a community, we say this is a priority to house our children and go after the national grants to bring to Portland to resolve it. It's just a matter of funding, because the programs, the knowledge, the expertise, and the homeless kids outside are definitely there.
We have on our list, in a priority order, the very next population to be served will be homeless youth, and we have not quite given up yet on the federal housing resources. We're still in line, and that's why we were happy that Tipper Gore was here last week to talk about homelessness, because we still are desperate to pick up some loose change that they might have laying around in Washington, D.C. But keep us pointed on this, because the community needs to hold local government accountable on this one. We are not doing a good job with either the youth or with families, and we're going to have to be harassed.
You may direct your questions to either of the panelists or to one individually.
Jim Francisconi, City Club members. First of all, I'd like to thank both of you for your advocacy and your work on behalf of the homeless at a time when it was not popular compared to other things.
Is it popular now?
Well, homelessness is not. Housing is becoming more significant, which is a later point I want to make. The second thing, Gretchen, is I want to specifically congratulate you not only on your proposal here, which I support, but also on linking the issue of working class housing needs with the homeless in a way that runs counter to the national dialogue where we pit the working class versus the poor. And so I want to thank you for broadening the discussion here. My specific question to you is that several times in your talk you brought up the River District, and in your remarks I think you said, if I heard you correctly, that if we're going to do what needs to be done in the River District, which I assume you mean reaching the low and moderate income target goals at which the River District was sold, you need the new $15 million revenue source in order to reach those specific goals. Do I understand that correctly?
By our estimates at this point, as you notice, I didn't offer a way to pay for it yet, but our estimates are that $15 million a year would give the $5 million a year that the River District needs for a decade, $5 million or more for Portland's neighborhoods, and some additional resources into specifically targeting homeless facilities, hopefully in the neighborhoods, compatible with the neighborhoods, to replace the homeless system.
Okay, but not just homeless. Would some of that money also be for low and moderate income housing in the neighborhood? Okay,
Absolutely.
But my question then really is, without that new revenue source, which would include the $5 million for the River District, that means there isn't even the revenue now for the River District targets.
The city budget for this year and next year, which will be heard in public meetings in April, has identified a $4 million housing investment fund. It's the first time we've used local resources for housing, so it's very exciting, but you can see it's just not enough. But we have also identified $4.7 million over a 3-year period that we will commit to the River District. So we have made a down payment, in my view, on both neighborhood low and moderate income housing and the River District. But what we really need as a community is not wait until this time next year in doing the next year's budget and say, oops, we don't have any more money. We need to find the resource now.
I have to ask you to give others a chance here now. Thank you.
Len Freiser, City Club member. Another question on youth for both of you. Could you please discuss your view of the responsibility of the Portland School Board to homeless youth?
Len's a candidate. I think that's only fair that we point it out.
Clearly, there's a responsibility for the school board to educate all youth, including homeless youth. And I know for the youth, many of the youth in downtown, the possibility exists for those kids to go to Lincoln High School, for example. While that possibility exists, in reality, the homeless youth are not very welcome at Lincoln High School, and are not equipped to go to Lincoln High School since they're sleeping outside and have no place to study and no money for books, and many obstacles. I think that if we're going to educate youth, including homeless youth, there has to be an alternative to the traditional high school. For educating homeless youth, there needs to be an alternative so that kids, once they get into housing, can also get into education programs. I think it's a responsibility of Portland Public Schools to develop that alternative education, not just try and mainstream youth into existing high schools.
But Portland Public Schools has also worked with the YWCA downtown, which provides a homeless school for the children, the little ones in homeless families, and they're given a different program for the very reasons Jean mentions for the teenagers, is that they don't quite fit in the regular school system because they're frequently moving and living in different places. So the school district has been supportive, but we'll look forward to working with you on that issue.
I think the corollary to that is, isn't the Children's Services Division also responsible for homeless youth under the age of 18?
Next question.
Paul Milius, City Club member. I'm a property owner who had the bright idea that I would turn the duplex that I live in into a triplex, which seems to be a reasonable thing to do and provides infill and additional affordable housing and so on. However, the first hurdle was the Bureau of Buildings and the codes. And I can certainly agree with additional smoke detectors and a variety of other things, but 12 inches worth of landscaping at the back of the property that nobody's going to see, a couple of $1,000s. Anyway, the question is, what will you do to make it easier for granny flats, the kind of individual homeowner infill type things, without putting us through the same kind of hoops that you put major commercial developers through?
As you know, I'm glad you asked because I couldn't quite work it into my speech. We tried with the Albina Community Plan to speed up processes that allowed the higher density infill things. We do have to keep a balance between compatibility with the neighborhood, so I'm not gonna, you're not gonna get me to back down on landscaping requirements and things like that that make these changes in these higher density units fit into neighborhoods. But we have a real challenge, and we're working on it right now to get a citywide priority for the granny flats issue. The Planning Commission seems to be struggling with it more than I think they need to, so you might want to lobby them a little bit. That this is an important issue and very critical to our ability. Think of it in these terms: the 50,000 unit goal that Steve Shell helped write with us in Future Focus, even before 2040 was real. We set this goal for the city of Portland. It translates to about 500 units, not people, units in every neighborhood. Portland has 100 neighborhood associations. So if you pull out the River District and get some really high density there in South Macadam or some of these other large parcels, you maybe get it down to 400 or 450 a neighborhood. But we're still talking about a lot of this money and resource being needed in Portland neighborhoods to meet these goals.
Steve Shell, member. First of all, I'd like to say I admire both of you for your long tenacity in this area. Many times it's been very thankless, and I really express my admiration for that. The question I have, I guess, is really directed to you, Gretchen. We've done a lot of planning. For instance, there's the CHAZ program. We've talked about planning in the metropolitan area. And in a way, this $15 million proposal is a kind of a specific application of some of that. But I wonder if you could sketch for us kind of where we are in a broad sense in terms of planning for these problems, the homeless problems and the affordable housing problems throughout our area, not just in Portland. And maybe, Jean, you could add a little to do. Thank you.
The planning, I've often said, is what Portland does best, and where Bob Stacy's glaring at me again, because my motto down at City Hall is plan less, do more. He didn't like that as the head of the Planning Bureau, but I think we do it very well. We have never moved affordable housing as a conversation. We don't have a regional CHAZ comprehensive housing strategy, for example. We haven't done that, but I am very, very encouraged in working with Metro over the past couple years, because the 2040 discussions finally got people to focus on the connectedness between housing affordability and growth planning. And it's a very, very exciting trend. It's gonna take a lot of work, but for example, on MTAC now, one of the technical committees there is an affordable housing advocate. This is new. So in terms of planning, I think we're planned out. I think we know what we need to do. We need money. And my most fervent wish would be that this kind of a housing investment fund, or whatever we're going to call it, was in fact a regional function. I mean, since I don't want to be glib about not having a suggestion as to what the revenue source ought to be for this, but many communities around the country use systems development charge or real estate transfer taxes or a variety of things tied to housing production and housing sales to pay for affordable housing. So, you know, Metro has chosen not to institute that kind of a tax right now. Maybe at some point we could do it, because it is in fact a regional problem, and we need to solve affordability throughout the area.
I think also that a great deal of the progress we've made in terms of developing programs, particularly for single homeless adults, has come because we've had a plan. All the agencies and the funders came together and developed a plan. It was not always a harmonious planning process, but once it was finished, we had a blueprint that we signed off on. And particular, for my example, getting additional shelter for homeless women and having that shelter outside of the Burnside area is a tremendous step forward, and I don't think it would have happened without a plan for this piece moves from Burnside to the east side, different things happen on the east side to the west side. That wouldn't happen unless there was a planning process that had gone into that.
We have time for one more question.
Ray Polani, City Club member. When Gretchen came in, she looked at me and says, "Are you going to say something about transportation? I don't want to let you down." Can you agree that to the extent that we improve and make more transit available, we are actually helping the homeless population, the poor population, more of the middle class as time goes on, in that we are avoiding for them the sizable cost of automobile ownership?
Absolutely.
I was hoping you would say.
As always, Ray, you're right.
Putting money in their pocket for better health.
I want to echo, I'm sure on behalf of all the membership, Steve Shell's congratulations to you for your leadership over these years in what is obviously a very difficult area, and one that I think with your help and your direction we can make some progress in. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. We're adjourned.
Governor Roberts, with or without your charts, you're always more than welcome at City Club. Thank you very much for coming before us today. We're adjourned.